The Battle of Chosin Reservoir, fought from November 27th to December 13th, 1950, stands as a pivotal and grueling episode in the Korean War. This confrontation between United Nations (UN) forces and the Chinese People's Volunteer Army (PVA) unfolded in the rugged, mountainous terrain surrounding the Chosin Reservoir in North Korea, under some of the most severe winter conditions recorded during the conflict. This is the second video of a trilogy about the battles of the Korean War. Hi there, I'm Kyle, the host of History of Human Evolution, with a PhD in history and a love for storytelling. I'm here to guide you through the fascinating journey of our species. If you like to explore the past, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share your thoughts below. By late November 1950, the momentum of the Korean War had shifted dramatically. United Nations forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, had pushed deep into North Korea following the success of the Inchon landing and the breakout from the Pusan perimeter. The objective was clear: to advance to the Yalu River, the natural border between North Korea and China, and bring a swift end to the war. Confidence among American and Allied commanders was high. They believed that the North Korean People's Army had been shattered and that resistance would soon collapse entirely. But this assessment failed to account for a critical development. In October, as UN forces advanced, the People's Republic of China had secretly entered the war. Chairman Mao Zedong, fearing that American forces on China's border posed a direct threat, ordered the deployment of the People's Volunteer Army, PVA. The Chinese 9th Army Group, consisting of more than 120,000 troops under the command of General Song Shirluen, moved undetected across the Yalu River into the mountainous terrain of North Korea. By late November, they had taken up concealed positions in the Chosin Reservoir region, waiting for the moment to strike. American forces, spread thin across the rugged, freezing landscape, were unaware of the scale of the threat. The 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General Oliver P. Smith, led the advance toward the Chosin Reservoir, supported by elements of the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Division and South Korean units. The freezing temperatures, dropping as low as -30 degrees Fahrenheit, -34 degrees Celsius, complicated logistics and movement. Vehicles froze, weapons malfunctioned, and the men, ill-equipped for extreme cold, struggled against the elements. But despite the deteriorating conditions, the orders from higher command remained unchanged: press forward, reach the Yalu, and secure final victory. Warnings of Chinese involvement were dismissed. Intelligence reports from captured Chinese prisoners indicated the presence of large enemy formations in the mountains, but these were largely ignored by MacArthur's headquarters. The prevailing belief was that China would not risk full-scale intervention. Even as Chinese units launched limited attacks in October and November, they were interpreted as defensive rearguard actions, not an indication of an impending offensive. Then, on the night of November 27th, the illusion of security shattered. From the ridges and valleys surrounding the reservoir, tens of thousands of Chinese troops emerged from their concealed positions, encircling UN forces. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir had begun, and what had seemed like the final phase of the war was now a fight for survival. The battle that unfolded at Chosin Reservoir would pit two vastly different military forces against one another, each shaped by distinct strategic imperatives, logistical realities, and battlefield doctrines. On one side stood the United Nations forces, primarily composed of the U.S. 1st Marine Division, elements of the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Division, and supporting South Korean and British units. Numbering approximately 30,000 men, these forces were highly trained, well-equipped, and supported by air superiority. However, they were stretched thin across the unforgiving terrain of North Korea, operating under the assumption that they were nearing the final phase of the war. Opposing them was the Chinese 9th Army Group, commanded by General Song Shirluen. This force, numbering over 120,000 soldiers, had crossed the Yalu River in secret, moving undetected through mountainous terrain to establish a position of overwhelming numerical advantage. The Chinese strategy was built on encirclement and annihilation. Avoiding large-scale conventional engagements, their troops moved at night, using stealth and terrain to their advantage. They aimed to cut off UN supply lines, sever communication routes, and destroy the isolated units piece by piece. The Marines, under Major General Oliver P. Smith, understood the dangers of overextension and had been advancing cautiously, reinforcing positions along the way. Smith, skeptical of higher command's confidence, ensured that his forces established defensive perimeters at key locations, a decision that would later prove critical to their survival. The Army's 31st Regimental Combat Team, on the other hand, was positioned on the eastern side of the reservoir in a more exposed formation, lacking the same level of preparation. The battle was also defined by the stark contrast in logistics. UN forces relied on mechanized transport, supply lines stretching back to the coastal ports, and close air support from the 5th Air Force. Artillery and tanks provided formidable firepower, but they were dependent on roads that were few and treacherous. In contrast, the Chinese army moved light and fast, carrying supplies on foot or by mule. Their soldiers, poorly clothed for the brutal winter, often relied on captured UN supplies to sustain themselves. Their tactics favored sheer numbers, ambushes, and human wave assaults to overwhelm fortified positions. In the days leading up to November 27th, neither side fully grasped the scale of the battle to come. The UN forces believed they were conducting a final sweep before reaching the Yalu, while the Chinese command saw an opportunity to deliver a crippling blow to the most elite units of the UN coalition. What followed would be one of the most brutal and harrowing engagements of the Korean War, where strategy and doctrine would be tested against the unrelenting forces of nature and war. On the night of November 27, 1950, the stillness of the frozen Chosin Reservoir was shattered. Without warning, waves of Chinese infantry emerged from the surrounding mountains, moving swiftly through the darkness. Using whistles, bugles, and shouts to coordinate their assault, they crashed into isolated UN positions with overwhelming force. The 9th Army Group, which had remained undetected for weeks, had now fully revealed itself, executing a massive encirclement operation designed to trap and annihilate the UN forces. The heaviest attacks fell on the Army's 31st Regimental Combat Team on the eastern side of the reservoir, known later as Task Force Faith. Scattered along a narrow stretch of road leading to the Punggye-ri Inlet, these troops lacked the defensive depth to withstand a sustained assault. Chinese forces infiltrated their positions, cutting units off from one another. Artillery crews were overrun, medics fought with rifles, and battalion headquarters were overwhelmed in desperate hand-to-hand combat. Communication lines collapsed, and within hours, Task Force Faith was effectively encircled. To the west, at Udamanai, the 1st Marine Division faced an equally ferocious assault. Unlike the Army units, the Marines had constructed strong defensive perimeters and positioned artillery for maximum coverage. Throughout the night, they fought off wave after wave of Chinese infantry, holding their lines with disciplined fire and concentrated artillery barrages. The bitter cold froze weapons, jammed machine guns, and made even the simplest tasks an ordeal. Marines had to urinate on their rifle bolts to keep them from locking up in the sub-zero temperatures. Frostbite set in as men lost feeling in their hands and feet, but the attacks did not stop. By morning, the scope of the Chinese offensive became clear. Every UN unit in the Chosin sector was under attack, their supply lines cut, their exit routes blocked. The Chinese command had executed its strategy with precision, surrounding the entire force with the intent of annihilation. Yet, despite their numerical superiority, the PVA faced severe logistical limitations. Many of their soldiers had no winter clothing beyond thin cotton uniforms. Ammunition was limited, and food shortages were widespread. The Chinese relied on speed and aggression, but with each failed assault, their losses mounted. The Marines at Udamanai knew they could not hold indefinitely. If they remained in place, they would be destroyed. The only option was to break out southward, fighting their way back to Halberstam, the vital logistical hub at the southern end of the reservoir. This would require a fighting retreat through miles of enemy-infested terrain, all while keeping thousands of wounded and frostbitten men alive. As the battle raged, air support became a lifeline. The 5th Air Force and Marine Aviation units conducted relentless bombing and strafing runs, keeping the Chinese at bay and providing critical airdrops of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. But the reality was inescapable. Every UN position was under siege, and the retreat would be just as brutal as the battle itself. By December 13, 1950, the last of the UN forces had reached the port of Hungnam, marking the end of the brutal withdrawal from the Chosin Reservoir. The battle had inflicted staggering losses on both sides, but the cost of survival had been immense. The 1st Marine Division, along with elements of the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Division and South Korean units, had fought their way through 78 miles of mountainous terrain under relentless enemy attacks and freezing temperatures that reached as low as -40 degrees Fahrenheit, -40 degrees Celsius. Casualties among UN forces were severe. Of the approximately 30,000 troops engaged in the battle, over 17,000 were listed as killed, wounded, or missing. Many of these were the result of frostbite and exposure, with thousands of men suffering permanent injuries from the extreme cold. The 1st Marine Division alone sustained more than 4,500 battle casualties, with an additional 7,300 non-combat casualties, primarily due to frostbite and other cold-related conditions. The U.S. Army's task force faith on the eastern side of the reservoir was decimated, losing over 2,500 men in what became one of the most tragic episodes of the battle. Only a fraction of its force managed to escape the encirclement. For the Chinese 9th Army Group, the losses were catastrophic. Though estimates vary, Chinese casualties ranged between 40,000 and 60,000, with thousands succumbing to frostbite and starvation. Poorly supplied and ill-equipped for the harsh winter conditions, many Chinese troops froze to death in their positions. Some entire units, unable to receive reinforcements or resupply, were wiped out by artillery fire and airstrikes. The sheer scale of their losses effectively crippled the 9th Army Group, rendering it combat ineffective for the remainder of the war. Despite the numerical advantage and strategic encirclement, the Chinese failed to destroy the UN forces at Chosin. The breakout, described as a fighting withdrawal, demonstrated the discipline, coordination, and resilience of the Marines and soldiers involved. Though forced to retreat, they managed to bring out the majority of their wounded, maintain unit cohesion, and inflict disproportionate casualties on the enemy. The evacuation at Hungnam, which followed in the weeks after the battle, allowed over 100,000 UN troops and tens of thousands of refugees to escape, preventing a total collapse in northeastern Korea. The cost of the battle was measured not just in the dead and wounded, but in its broader impact on the war. The destruction of the Chinese 9th Army Group forced Beijing to reconsider the feasibility of large-scale offensives, buying time for UN forces to stabilize a defensive line further south. The resilience of the UN troops, particularly the 1st Marine Division, became the defining legacy of Chosin Reservoir, an engagement that, though a tactical withdrawal, remained one of the most remarkable displays of endurance and combat effectiveness in military history. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir altered the strategic landscape of the Korean War. What had begun as an ambitious push to the Yalu River ended in a brutal retreat, forcing UN forces to abandon their northernmost positions and fundamentally reshaping their objectives in the conflict. The defeat highlighted the limitations of MacArthur's strategy, which had underestimated both the scale of Chinese intervention and the logistical challenges of fighting in the unforgiving terrain of North Korea. The retreat from Chosin, along with simultaneous Chinese offensives across the peninsula, led to a complete reevaluation of UN war aims, shifting the focus from unification to containment. For China, the battle proved its ability to wage large-scale warfare against a technologically superior opponent. Despite suffering immense casualties, the Chinese 9th Army Group had succeeded in forcing UN forces to withdraw from northeastern Korea, securing a significant propaganda victory for Beijing. Mao Zedong could now justify continued involvement in the war, using the battle to reinforce China's commitment to supporting North Korea. However, the staggering losses suffered by the 9th Army Group severely weakened China's operational capacity, preventing further large-scale offensives in the immediate aftermath. On the American side, the breakout from Chosin demonstrated the effectiveness of disciplined, coordinated withdrawals under extreme conditions. The successful evacuation of thousands of wounded troops and refugees at Hungnam allowed the UN command to preserve its combat strength, preventing what could have been a far more disastrous outcome. The battle also cemented the reputation of the 1st Marine Division as an elite fighting force, reinforcing the importance of combined arms operations, air support, and logistical coordination in modern warfare. The long-term effects of Chosin went beyond the battlefield. The defeat led to General MacArthur's increasing marginalization within the U.S. government, as his continued insistence on escalating the war, including the possible use of nuclear weapons, brought him into direct conflict with President Truman. Within months, MacArthur would be relieved of command, marking a decisive shift in U.S. military leadership and signaling a more measured approach to the conflict. Militarily, the battle highlighted the difficulties of overextension in a hostile environment. The harsh winter conditions, the logistical challenges of mountainous warfare, and the vulnerability of stretched supply lines all reinforced the need for a more defensible posture. The withdrawal to the 38th parallel in early 1951 stabilized the front and set the stage for the protracted negotiations that would ultimately define the later years of the war. Though Chosin ended in retreat, its strategic consequences extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. It reshaped military planning, influenced political decision-making in both Washington and Beijing, and demonstrated the endurance of UN forces under overwhelming odds. The battle's impact would continue to be studied in military academies for decades, serving as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the resilience of those who fought it. We'd love to hear your thoughts on possible future topics. What areas of human evolution would you like to explore next? Leave your suggestions in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going. As always, our references and further reading are listed in the description below if you'd like to dive deeper into the subject. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.